Hey, welcome to the Virtually Speaking podcast series on exploring VMware Cloud Foundation inside the private cloud. On this episode, we're talking about the cloud admin journey. My name is Pete Flecha. I'll be your host, and joining me as usual is my good friend, Mr. John Nicholson. John, how you doing, buddy?
Feeling good, feeling fancy. This is there's a lot of information to cover here, and it's also just great that we're able to break this down to first principles.
I love it. Yeah, starting from the very top, walking through value proposition, getting the executive overview, and that's all great. Understanding what's inside of VMware Cloud Foundation. But this is where it gets real fun, where we start to talk about what does this look like from a vSphere administrator's perspective, from day zero all the way to day two. Heath, Kyle, welcome back, and thank you for joining this conversation. Kyle, I want to start with you. I know you recently did a session at VMware Explorer, a day in the life of the vSphere admin, and it reminded me of this section because I thought, that's perfect. I want to talk about operations. I want to talk about what it looks like for a vSphere administrator, but now I want to talk about what it looks like for a cloud admin. So maybe you can start off and start with that and let us know what it looks like.
Yeah, so the idea behind the session, is I talked to a lot of customers and I realized that there's a lot of very competent vSphere admins out there who are running pretty large environments, and they've got this down. They've got the procedures down. They've been doing it for a number of years, and we come in with this thing called the SDDC Manager and say, hey, we got this automation. We're going to make your life easier. And they just kind of look at me and go, but I don't need you to make my life easier. And there's kind of this gap. What is it this thing's doing for me, and why do I care? And so in the session, the way I kind of approach it is this idea that as a vSphere admin working today in the data center, we've gone from this doing things in weeks or even months to hours and days. I need to stand up a new cluster. I always start with a scenario of, I got developers coming in on Monday, and it's Friday afternoon, and the boss comes to me and says, I need you to stand up a Kubernetes cluster so these guys can hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Well, I can't do that if I don't have some type of automation and some type of capability to go in and say, hey, SDDC Manager, create me a workload domain real quick. Let me go in and enable the Kubernetes, turn that into a supervisor cluster, and they're off and running. And I can do that in a couple of hours, as opposed to something that would be, tickets passed back and forth and a couple of days of negotiation, and then all of a sudden a week later I can give them a cluster. And meanwhile, you've had these developers sitting on the payroll for a week doing nothing because you're trying to get infrastructure. So just trying to show how, as a vSphere admin, why is this something that you should be looking at in terms of how is this going to make me more efficient? How is this going to help me to do things faster? How is this going to help me to take care of those mundane things? I don't want to be worried about setting VM kernel interfaces and worried about typos. I just want to stand up a cluster so I can start working with private AI. I can start working with Kubernetes. I want to work at that level above. I want to get those applications running. I don't want to be worried about the underlying details of, did I misconfigure a VDS? Type thing. So the idea of, from a vSphere admin or a cloud admin, as we're calling them now, why do you need this? Just kind of helping them understand the idea of doing things at scale and automating the repetitive task and getting you out of the weeds and up so you can start focusing on those new things. Does your company have private AI initiative? Are they looking to you to help drive that? Well, if so, you got to be agile and responsive. You can't be saying, it'll take me a month to stand this up. You got to be able to stand it up in a couple of days and say, we're ready to go.
Well, and I like, you're talking about the story about bringing this stuff up, but also it's also interesting seeing how some of the components are just the day-to-day activities, some of the lifecycle activities or some of those. How can this make the cloud admin's job easier in terms of getting some of those things off their plate so they can have more focus?
Yeah, so the SDDC Manager, let's say you come back from lunch and all of a sudden you get this email from your boss saying, I need to stand up another cluster. You get an email from somebody in the finance team saying, hey, it's the end of the month. We're doing some payroll processing. I need your cluster bigger. So can you add a couple of hosts? You got another guy coming over saying, hey, I want to look at this Kubernetes stuff. And all of a sudden you just get inundated with all these different requests. And, you start thinking, okay, well, how am I going to get all these things done? Well, with the SDDC Manager, I can go in and create a workload domain. I can go in and expand a cluster. I can go in and enable Kubernetes. I can go in and deploy an edge cluster, expand. I can do all these, and I can do them all in parallel. And I can have all these tasks kind of running in parallel and in the background using the automation without having to go back and set everything up. And
not going through 50 manual steps. Yeah. Go find your run book. Hope you don't typo. I'm always selecting the wrong VM kernel port.
Right. And to that point, you don't end up with, I set this cluster up last week, and I set this one up this week, and guess what? I did this different, I named this different, and suddenly you got config drift, or you spent hours troubleshooting because I did 186 instead of 168 on my IP address because I I just transposed something and it took me 2 hours to figure that out.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's more of a day 2 type conversation. I want to start with day 0. Like, let's take it from the very beginning. Heath, what does it look like for a VMware Cloud admin or a VMware Cloud Foundation admin, if you will, on day 0? How do they get started?
Right. So with VMware Cloud Foundation, as it is today, we have to birth this cloud, right? We have to create it.
It needs to exist.
It needs to start from somewhere, right? So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem there, and we got to solve that by deploying what we call the Cloud Builder appliance, right? So this is a simple virtual machine that you download off of the VMware website through our software portal. And you deploy this virtual machine on existing infrastructure, right? Most of our customers that have bought VMware Cloud Foundation already have vSphere or ESXi running somewhere in the environment. So you deploy that VM on your existing infrastructure, and it needs to be able to connect to some new hosts so we can build what we call the management domain. Now, the management domain consists of 4 hosts, and we're going to build them into a vSphere cluster from day 0. So we just need network connectivity from those 4 brand new hosts. That's just the minimum we need to get started is 4 brand new hosts. And we need a network connectivity to that virtual machine, the Cloud Builder appliance. So once you got the Cloud Builder installed and stood up, it's got a web interface. It's real easy to use. And we provide an Excel spreadsheet that has inputs on it for how to stand up the cloud infrastructure. And on that Excel spreadsheet contains information for what are the IP addresses you want to use for the ESXi hosts and for the vCenter, and what passwords. And it gives you all kinds of opportunities to key in things incorrectly, just like John was saying, right?
I like Excel, the most powerful database on the planet, purely because I can just drag the cell down and it'll clone things for me. Or it'll sequentially do the numbers. That's like my favorite trick.
Yes.
So basic things, right? So we're not talking about having to this is an automated process, right? So deploying all this stuff, I don't need to study and learn how to do this. I'm essentially just
my HA settings aren't in here.
Not at all, right? In fact, we're still using VLANs. We ask for what VLANs do you want to deploy, pieces of this infrastructure on. And so once you fill all that out, we'll take that spreadsheet and feed it into the web interface for the Cloud Builder appliance. It will then connect to those 4 brand new hosts and actually create a vSAN cluster, install the vCenter server, configure vSAN.
Oh, this solves the chicken egg problem. Which came first, the vCenter or the data store? So it does the bring up for you.
It does. It's actually really cool to watch it in the background and see all this come to life, right? So you see vSAN coming online. You see the ESXi host get configured for NSX, right? And you see NSX management plane get installed and created. And all within a few hours, right? If you think about this from a manual perspective, actually trying to install all these different components, there's a lot of clicks.
This is a 2-week professional services scope.
Exactly. You feed it this spreadsheet, within a couple hours, you have an entire software-defined data center. We've got that now management domain built. And so that's where we're running our management appliances. And from there, we can go on to workload domains.
Nice, I like that. And so workload domains, is there any limitation to how many workload domains I can have, or how do people traditionally set up workload domains?
There's a few different workload domain architectures, right? So there are some maximums in within the configuration, but so we've got the management domain, and that's where everything kind of gets created and stood up. From there, we want to scale out the infrastructure, right? So to scale out, we're going to add what we call a virtual infrastructure workload domain. And this is where we're going to do some little separation, right? We're going to create a separate area for your business applications to run. And so your business apps run on, we're going to add more hosts, right? So clear there. So we have more hosts that we add to the infrastructure. And we're going to create what we call another virtual infrastructure workload domain. When we create that, we actually create another vCenter and we create another NSX management plane. With that, we get separation, right? So we get the management domain and this workload domain for our business applications. Now, the vCenter and the NSX management plane for that virtual infrastructure workload domain, those VMs live inside the management domain. So when we're looking at what's running on top of those new virtual infrastructure hosts for that workload domain, there's no management applications or virtual machines in there. It's just for the business applications. Right, so we have a nice clean separation of where your management applications live and where your business applications live. And it just keeps things nice and clean. We don't have noisy neighbor issues, and we can continue to scale out from there, right? And you asked about how much. Well, we can go up to I'm trying to remember the number off the top of my head.
So it's 25 today.
Okay.
Workload domains.
And you can have multiple clusters in each workload.
Yeah, and I was just going to point that out. When it comes to actually scaling up, scaling out, a lot of viewers probably are aware of the old vCenter sprawl days when everybody was like, "Well, I got too many vCenters, and I need to get my vCenter numbers down." And now we're talking about deploying workload domains, and they're like, "Doesn't that just add more vCenters?" And there is some thought that needs to go into your design in terms of how many workload domains. But remember, behind each workload domain, you can have up to 64 vSphere clusters configured. And so the way you scale up and scale out is not by proliferating more vCenters, but by creating clusters behind these vCenters. So within a workload domain, even the manager domain, I can add more clusters, and I can expand those clusters, make those clusters bigger, make them smaller. But the 25, the limit of 25 workload domains, that's where we're at today. There's two things you need to be aware of. We talked earlier about isolated workload domains versus workload domains deployed in enhanced link mode. Within vSphere, there is a limit on the number of vCenters that can be in enhanced link mode. That limit's 15. So you can have up to 15 in enhanced link mode. The other 10 would have to be isolated.
But if I've got 15 vCenters talking to each other that have dozens of clusters each, like that's
pretty big.
Yeah, I'm going to sit there and load vCenter and just go, wow.
Yeah.
And
and you want to think about your patching and your upgrade process as well, because sometimes it's I don't necessarily want to have to patch 25 vCenters if I don't need to.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 or 3 vCenters is all I need, but maybe I want to have a test, dev, and a prod, and I need a separate vCenter for those. So maybe I go 4 or 5. So that 25 is actually a pretty good number, and I think most people could probably work within that. And then the way we scale out is with those vSphere clusters and by adding vSphere clusters behind those. And when you start getting into the sizing of how big can these clusters be, how many clusters, we're just kind of at the mercy of the vSphere configuration maximums. We do have VCF configuration maximums. You'll kind of need to check both. There are some cases where we don't really go to the vSphere maximums, and we do impose some additional limits. But for the most part, it's very scalable. You can get a very big environment up and running very quickly just by creating a few workload domains and then putting a fair number of clusters behind those workload domains.
All right, well, quick question then. If I start scaling out and I start having multiple workload domains and using multiple vCenters, how does that affect my licensing? Do I have to pay for all of these additional vCenters?
It sounds complicated to track. In fact, I'm going to need to get out Excel, my favorite database, to track all my vCenter licenses, right?
Yeah.
It is a top question that comes, ever since we've been doing VMware Cloud Foundation for multiple years now, that customers are like, wait, how do we license? That sounds expensive, right? From a vCenter perspective. And the answer is no, it's included, right? It's included in the core costs of VMware Cloud Foundation, and it always has been. So we're licensed up to the workload domain maximum, right? So up to 25 vCenters inside of a workload or inside of VMware Cloud Foundation. And so you can think about some really interesting architectures. I mean, Kyle mentioned a few, how you can set up test, dev, and prod. You can have a DMZ workload domain. I've even talked about in the past separating things like, hey, well, let's make a workload domain for Windows admins and another one for the Linux admins, right? Give them their own vCenter in each one, and they can do
application licensing.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of things like that. Or you can make an Oracle one, or whatever it is you need to create separation inside your environment, whether it's business units or applications. It's a boundary.
Yeah. So speaking of boundaries, what about remote workload domains? What are my options there?
Yeah, so remote workload domains, we do have support for that. It's one thing I kind of stress is while we're talking about maximums and configuration maximums, keep in mind that these are all things that will change. So every time we have a new release, check the release notes and see where we've expanded, because some of these are just limitations imposed based on what we were able to test and validate, not so much based on product limitations.
That is like a core tenet of software engineering that I've discovered of working here 8 years. Is there's very much of like, well, where did this number come from? Well, I had to go to lunch. I ran out of time to test.
Right. So when we talk about these numbers, and when we get to remote workload domains, it's important to understand, because I believe with the current version of Cloud Foundation, which as of this recording would be 5.1.1, we're limited to 8 remote workload domains. And so you can create 8 remote workload domains, and within those you can have 1 cluster behind them. Now that doesn't really scale to some of these large things where, like, I have a retail store and I need to have
people are
hundreds.
obviously asking for more, so we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, and I just kind of point out that part of the reason why we had the limitations we have now is tied in with the way we do patching and So you got the SDC manager, and that SDC manager is going to be pushing updates out to these remote clusters. The vCenter servers are going to run at the main location as part of that management domain. These remote workload domains are going to be running a distance away.
So if I have 10 hosts there, I'm setting the same patch 10 times.
Yeah, and
like
so
scaling and timing.
And so there is some WAN bandwidth and some, we do require pretty reliable communication, because since the vCenter is at the central site and the remote clusters out there, we have to take into account, the link has to be somewhat reliable. I can't have a flappy link that's constantly going down, or it goes down for a long period of time, because that's going to cause problems.
Time to deploy some Velo to solve
Yeah, I need to have bandwidth so that if I need to push out,
get one good link or 3 interesting ones and band-aid them together.
I think in our documentation we recommend or highly recommend at least 2 site links.
Yeah. So when it comes to remote clusters, just be aware, it's not necessarily an edge solution, for like those, where you need to have hundreds or thousands. But there is the capability there in Cloud Foundation, and this is an area where keep watching the release notes and see how we proceed forward. There's a lot of work being done to.
Kyle is a well-disciplined man. He's
no forward-looking statements here.
Not
no
going to give up the secret sauce on this podcast. He's like, this is what it is today. Watch that space. Yeah, I respect that, Kyle. So let's move to day one. Heath, like, what does day one look like?
Right. So day one, right? We've deployed the management workload domain. We've started to deploy some more infrastructure workload domains. We have things like being able to do that are unique to the SDC manager, right? So we can do password management, right, within the SDC manager. So we've deployed all this infrastructure.
Oh, that is great, because there's nothing like finding that one host that you typo the password on.
Right, right. You don't have to actually just use VMware 123 bang right across all your ESXi hosts.
And this will rotate them for you?
It can. That's exactly it. So we can do password rotation. We can do password updates where you key in a password you want. And we have API integration to store it in a third-party vault, right? And so there's a lot of very useful tools there. Nobody likes it when your vSphere or admin leaves and goes to another org, and now you've all this infrastructure and you've got to go change passwords, right? It's a critical component to be able to manage all that infrastructure.
And we're talking about passwords for the vCenter, for the SXI host, the NSX manager, the ARIA components, so the ARIA lifecycle manager, the ARIA ops, all those appliances are going to be centrally managed from the SDC manager. So very, very beneficial in that regard.
Well, we talked a little bit about this prior already in day zero, but we talked about workload domains. And so, did we cover all did we like finish that conversation on workload domains? We understand that there's the management domain, and then we understand that the workload domains, there's the limitations and all that stuff. What else do we need to know about the workload domains?
Some of the common questions that come up is this idea of a consolidated versus standard architecture. If I'm a smaller shop or I want to deploy an instance of Cloud Foundation in a remote location where I don't really need a lot of capacity, do I need to have a separate workload domain for my compute workloads, or can I run compute workloads on my management domain? And so the answer is the management domain is just a vSphere cluster. We call it a management domain, and it has a special role, and it's the first cluster, and it hosts a lot of our infrastructure components. But there's nothing to keep us from running compute workloads on that. As a matter of fact, when you do the bring up that Heath was talking about in that spreadsheet, it will ask you, are you planning to run your compute workloads on here? And if so, it will create resource pools.
Okay, so you can segment, because we have the tools. There's benefits obviously to separation to avoid noisy neighbor, but vSphere itself has some pretty good noisy neighbor controls, particularly in compute.
And so if you're going to be running compute workloads on that management domain, we'll create those resource pools and help you kind of establish that as part of bring up. And so, so the idea of you can deploy a Cloud Foundation instance and scale it up by adding more hosts. And it doesn't have to be 4 nodes. It could be 8 nodes. It could be 12 nodes. So you can get pretty large, and you can co-host the management and the compute side by side using resource pools. There are certain use cases where that would make sense, But usually, typically, when you are going to start expanding out and growing out, you want to create those VI workload domains. And we talked about how when you create those VI workload domains, you got a couple different topologies here. And that's what we call the standard architecture, because that's kind of the standard deployment. That's the typical. But when you get in there, you can start doing stretch clusters, where I can start putting them across different availability zones with vSAN stretch cluster in the background. You can do dual region deployments, and so I think that's kind of the the single region, consolidated, the single region standard, the dual region, the stretched are pretty much the core?
Yeah, we've talked about multiple workload domains. We can do multiple clusters. We can do a workload or SS single sign-on separation.
Yeah,
right?
the isolated where
Isolated
you have
workload
dedicated.
domains.
So, a lot of service providers or people who have businesses where they're kind of providing cluster as a service. The isolated workload domain is great because now I can have everybody on their own SSO domain, and kind of gives me that
Different lines of business
Yeah,
or groups.
and everybody's going to have their own NSX fabric. Or, and the NSX fabric is another interesting topic because when you stand up the management workload domain, we're going to instantiate an NSX fabric for that. And then,
Can we peer those to other NSX fabrics, or?
yeah, you can use NSX Federation and tie them all together so you can have the global managers. But when you create that first workload domain, we're going to require you create another NSX fabric because we're going to separate management from compute. But when you create your second, third, and subsequent VI workload domain, you can choose whether you want to join that existing NSX fabric or whether you want to have your own dedicated NSX fabric.
So if you're just segmenting compute for licensing or app or other reasons or chargeback versus like I want hard separation for security boundaries or things like that, or different NSX versioning control. That's pretty cool. One kind of last question I have here is I've got these workload domains, but what if I have, existing workloads? How do I get them into it?
Yeah, so existing workloads, almost everybody's going to have existing vSphere clusters running in their environment. One of the challenges we have with this is typically when you look at those environments, they could be running older versions of vSphere. They're all going to be slightly different. They're all going to have different configurations. So it's very hard for us to just basically point the SDC manager and say, take this over, because the SDC manager doesn't really have that awareness. We're working on some things. So getting back to the, don't peek behind.
Yeah, people have been asking.
So we're working on some things to help improve this process. But today, typically what we recommend is, stand up a new workload domain, a new VI workload domain. Stand it up. Get it up and running. You can have as few as 2 nodes if you're using Fiber Channel or NFS, or 3 nodes with vSAN. But stand it up. It's going to be a workload domain, and then you can use tools like Cross vCenter vMotion or HCX, or you can start moving those workloads in. And then once you get those workloads off, you can take those hosts. You can kind of bring them in,
Rip them down to bare metal, throw them in the
rip
pool.
them down, install the SXI, add them into the free pool, and create another workload domain, and then bring some more workloads over.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this approach where you can kind of move those workloads in as you can, so take that existing infrastructure that you have and just kind of create the first one, move it over, take those hosts, bring them in, put them under SDC
Just start
control.
eating the clusters one by one as you slurp all the workloads in, like it's.
Yeah. And so that's kind of where we're at today. Like I say, we're working on some things to make that process a little easier. So we can stay tuned.
Watch that space.
Yes.
Got it.
And
I hear you.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to it. I've got some some things coming that I'm looking forward to sharing.
All right, don't spill the beans.
Yeah.
Heath, let's talk about day 2. Now, when I think of day 2, the first thing that comes to mind for me is lifecycle management. So is that something that's different with VMware Cloud Foundation in terms of the day of the life of the vSphere admin?
It is. It is very different, right? We're making things easier and more cloud-like, right? And that's the goal here with Cloud Foundation. So when you think about all the different components that we talked about early on, you got ESXi host, the vCenter, vSAN, NSX, components like the ARIA suite and Tanzu and all these different components. You got to think about patching and upgrading and doing security patches and updates to all these different components. There's a lot of moving pieces. And when you do these kind of deployments of large infrastructure manually, you have to go start looking at compatibility across the matrix.
It feels like you're aligning planets or something.
Yeah,
sometimes.
exactly.
It's like, okay, this needs to upgrade there, but that can't go there until this goes there.
Yeah, if I install this vCenter, then my NSX doesn't work with that. But if I upgrade NSX, then all of a sudden Tanzu doesn't work with that. So it's like, how do I track all that?
It can get hairy very quick. And, you and I have a lack of hair, but
In this case, that's not a good thing.
yes,
right?
exactly.
Right.
It gets hairy quickly.
Yeah.
So VMware Cloud Foundation takes care of doing all that hard work for you and leads you down a path towards being able to do patches and upgrades, right? And so we lead you down a path to do patching and upgrading of all of the different components. We make sure that things are done in the right order and they're always compatible. Now, one of the things that comes up from time to time is like, okay, there's a day 0 vulnerability. How do we take care of that? So we have this tool called the async patch tool, right? And this allows us to actually do patches on a day 0 basis from the command line. So we don't have to worry about, hey, is the UI up to date?
Oh, nice.
For deploying these infrastructure? It's like, no, if it's a day 0 vulnerability, we want to get this patched as quickly as possible. We can go into the command line interface and actually patch something very, very quickly and keep everything secure within the environment.
So, we talk about, cloud and patching. So is this managed from the cloud? Like, how do I push these patches? How do I get these? Do I have to go download 13 components? How does this work?
Right. So that's a fantastic question, right? So I was recently speaking with a military contractor recently, one of our customers, and their environments is air gapped, right? Dark site, air gap. There's a lot of different terms for, offline cloud, whatever you want to call it, right? Do you support that for VMware Cloud Foundation? And the answer is yes, right? We have the tools and capabilities to actually move those patches and bundles from the cloud and sneaker net them into your dark air-gapped cloud and actually apply those patches and upgrades within the dark environment.
Okay, is this all done through VMware, what is it, not VUM, but like vSphere Lifecycle Manager, or?
If you look at the SDDC Manager under Lifecycle, there's this concept of a bundle.
Yeah.
And so the software is distributed in Cloud Foundation as bundles.
Okay.
Oh, so I don't have to go download each 13. I don't need the log insight patch or the 14 other component patch.
Right. So what we do is, he talked about the air-gapped environment. So let's just kind of move away from that and just say, let's say I'm connected to the internet. You can go in and register with your VMware Customer Connect account. You can basically register with the public repository.
That'll work through a proxy, right?
Yeah.
I want to do that.
You can set up a proxy and do it through a proxy. And what will happen is, as VMware publishes updates, they'll show up inside the SDDC Manager. You'll get a little blue banner saying, hey, updates available. And you go in and you'll see the updates. And you'll have the metadata there. And you can say, hey, here's like I'm running 5.1 and we just published a 5.11 update. I'll see these bundles become available. And I can read the metadata and see how big they are. And there'll be separate bundles for, like, say, the SDDC Manager, for vCenter, for ESXi, for NSX. And you'll download those. Once they're downloaded, then the SDDC Manager uses that metadata that knows about these patches to basically say, okay, there's patches been downloaded, so let's go ahead and apply those. Okay, so now you brought up the example of ESXi. So let's say I'm doing the ESXi patch. Well, when you create a workload domain, you are asked today if you want to use baselines or images as your upgrade method. Baselines is the old VUM, vSphere Update Manager, and that's going away. So we won't talk about baselines because we're going to talk about images. Images is the new VLCM that's built into vSphere.
Much better.
Right, and we're just using VLCM. So the VLCM you're using in vSphere is the same thing SDDC Manager is using. The only thing that's different is you're going to have your images built, your desired state images. You can have that all configured. And then the SDDC Manager, you're going to say, hey, I want you to patch these. It's going to use API calls over to put the host into maintenance mode, to call VLCM to say, hey, okay, remediate this host, get it up to the new image level.
And then HSM, it'll do my firmware patches.
Yeah. And so it's basically just going to do the upgrade, but it's orchestrated from the SDDC Manager. So if I have 5 clusters, I can do, we'll ask you, do you want to do them in parallel? Do you want to do them in clusters? So I could have 2 clusters, and I could be patching both clusters in parallel. Or I could say I want to do it sequentially, so we'll do cluster 1, then go to cluster 2.
So if I understood this correctly, like, I was a VUM guy for a very long time. At VLCM, I'm like, this is pretty cool, but I haven't really, I've got so much to do. I don't have real time to learn it. I can just go learn SDDC Manager instead, push the bundle, and then it goes and deals with all this for me. So.
Not quite, because you still have to go into vSphere and create your images.
Oh, okay. So still create the baseline.
We're not replacing the VLCM functionality. You still have to manage VLCM from the vSphere client,
Which, by the way, is super easy.
Which is easy. Yeah. But what we're doing is we're basically saying, hey, the SDDC Manager is going to say, hey, there's an update available. Let's go ahead and you schedule it and it will apply it, but it's going to assume that, and there's going to be pre-checks. So we have a pretty extensive pre-check, and that's something that's really nice about Cloud Foundation. Anytime you're going to do an update, or if you just want a general health, you can do a pre-check, and it will come back and give you a long report of.
I've seen engineering's had a real strong baseline of trying to make sure that upgrades go through consistently and try to raise that.
And that's where the pre-checks come in, because we do these checks to make sure everything, like, do you have any alerts inside your NSX Manager that are being ignored? The pre-check's going to fail saying, hey, you got alerts in NSX. You need to go address these. Can I put a host in maintenance mode? All these things. Yeah, is there enough resources? Do you have any issues around HA or DRS? And so those are the types of things. And so if you run the pre-check and the pre-check comes back as clean, then the chances of the upgrade going through successfully are very high, because we've learned over the years and we're constantly expanding. As a matter of fact, in one of the newer versions of Cloud Foundation, we actually add the ability now to update the pre-checks out of sync. So I can basically go out, get the latest pre-checks and bring it in.
Well, that's huge, because if I'm in a highly regulated environment and my cab only approves patching in certain months on the last Friday, I don't want to get to that Friday and it's 10 o'clock and I'm hitting the update all button. And then I find out something's broken that I'm going to need another window to go fix. I'm going to go talk to my cab and deal with my bureaucracy that,
Yeah, and as people call in with problems and support learns about these problems, we can turn those into
asynchronously push new
pre-checks,
health checks.
asynchronous pre-checks. So the next guy runs his pre-check. Guess what? We're going to check for that problem. So hopefully you can avoid it because
No two customers hit the same passion problem. So I like it.
So.
Well, it seems like there's so much to consider as a vSphere or cloud admin from day 0 all the way to day 2. This is just sort of a icing on the cake. I know that you guys have been doing some great work, whether it's blogging, writing technical content. Heath's done a great video series on YouTube for the VMware Cloud Foundation YouTube channel, going through deployment and other things. Where else can people go? Like, what's the main place for people to go to see this content and to better understand how to be an administrator for VMware Cloud Foundation?
So core.vmware.com, so C-O-R-E, that's probably one of the first places to go. That's what we call our tech zone site. And you're going to go there, you're going to see 3 categories. You're going to see a category for Cloud Foundation, a category for vSphere or VVF, and a category for vSAN. So that's one of the first places to go. And a lot of that content that you'll find on core.vmware is linked out to our YouTube channel. So there's a Cloud Foundation YouTube channel, and then the core.vmware.com or our tech zone site are probably 2 of the best resources to have and to go to look for information that's out there. So.
Very cool. Yeah, it's great stuff. As a matter of fact, I recently saw some lightboard work from our good friend Heath, who's working on a whole new lightboard setup in his house. We're not going to cover that on this episode, but I can't wait to see what you come up with your new your new home setup.
I'm excited myself, so it's pretty fun.
Heath, Kyle, thanks so much for joining us again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.